There are moments when nothing dramatic happens, yet everything seems to shift. You wake, move through familiar routines, and still sense that life is quietly arranging itself around you. No voice breaks the silence. No sign announces itself. And yet, choices feel subtly constrained, paths gently narrowed, as if something unseen is guiding without ever explaining why. It can feel like walking at dawn, when shapes are present but not yet defined, and you learn to move by attentiveness rather than certainty. Many people expect divine guidance to arrive with clarity and force, with certainty that can be pointed to, shared, and defended. But much of spiritual experience suggests the opposite: communication that is indirect, private, and easily overlooked. It arrives through restraint rather than command, through timing rather than spectacle. In a culture trained to value visibility, metrics, and immediate validation, this kind of guidance can feel indistinguishable from confusion or delay. Silence, however, is not necessarily emptiness. Psychological insight tells us that meaning matures through integration, not announcement. Spiritual philosophy echoes this, suggesting that understanding unfolds as the mind and character become capable of holding it. What feels like waiting may be formation. What feels like invisibility may be protection. Guidance that is too clear too early often collapses growth into compliance, bypassing discernment. If you have felt uncertain, overlooked, or unsure whether you are missing something important, that experience does not indicate failure or lack of purpose. It reflects a very human encounter with ambiguity, one that neither elevates nor excludes, but invites patience and honesty. This narrative explores the idea of a hidden calling and the art of discernment, drawing from theology, psychology, and contemplative traditions to examine quiet preparation and unseen shaping. It is not about decoding signs or forcing conclusions, but about learning how meaning slowly takes form. As you listen, there's no need to search for answers. Instead, listen for texture, for resonance, for the way understanding often arrives sideways in silence over time. Across many mystical traditions, divine guidance is rarely described as loud or directive. Instead, it is often portrayed as a quiet reorientation of attention, a gradual clarification of values, or an inner sense of alignment that becomes visible only in hindsight. In Jewish mysticism, guidance is associated with wisdom that settles into the heart over time, rather than descending as instruction. Christian contemplative traditions speak of discernment as a slow attunement to peace and coherence, not the reception of explicit messages. Sufi writings emphasize subtle attraction toward what is true, while Taoist philosophy frames guidance as learning to move with an underlying order that cannot be forced or fully articulated. Across cultures, the emphasis is not on hearing something new, but on perceiving differently. Philosophical perspectives reinforce this pattern. Plato suggested that truth is remembered rather than delivered, emerging through reflection and dialogue rather than command. Later thinkers argued that understanding arises when perception shifts, not when information is added. In this view, guidance does not interrupt ordinary experience, but reshapes how ordinary experience is interpreted. Silence plays a crucial role because it creates the conditions for noticing these shifts. When external signals are absent, attention turns inward and subtle distinctions become more apparent. Many spiritual frameworks therefore describe guidance as impressions, inner clarity, or changes in orientation rather than audible directives. This approach avoids reducing meaning to simple instructions, which can bypass responsibility and reflection. Guidance that arrives indirectly requires the individual to participate actively in interpretation. It must be tested against consistency, humility, and long-term coherence. The absence of dramatic signs is not a deficiency, but a safeguard, preventing premature certainty and encouraging maturity. Discernment becomes central in this process. Rather than assuming that every inner impression is authoritative, traditions emphasize careful evaluation. Discernment involves observing whether an insight leads to greater integration, compassion, and stability, or whether it produces anxiety, inflation, or withdrawal. It also involves time. Genuine clarity tends to persist and deepen, while projections often intensify quickly and collapse just as fast. Learning this distinction does not rely on certainty, but on repeated reflection and adjustment. Psychology offers useful language for understanding why people interpret quiet experiences as guidance without requiring supernatural explanations. Introspection allows individuals to notice internal states that usually remain implicit. When attention slows, patterns in thought and emotion become visible. Meaning-making describes the human tendency to organize experiences into narratives that provide coherence. When life events align in ways that feel significant, the mind naturally seeks interpretation. Pattern recognition, a fundamental cognitive function, helps individuals detect connections across time, sometimes attributing intentionality to sequences that feel purposeful. These processes do not invalidate spiritual interpretations, but they explain why guidance is often experienced as subtle rather than explicit. Loud, unambiguous signals would override these reflective mechanisms, reducing the role of interpretation. Quiet impressions allow individuals to integrate experience gradually, testing meaning against reality. Psychological research suggests that insight often emerges after periods of uncertainty, when the mind continues processing below conscious awareness. What feels like silence may actually be incubation. Mystical traditions frequently describe preparation as hidden and indirect for this reason. Growth that occurs beneath awareness is more stable than change imposed suddenly. Internal clarity often arrives as a shift in perspective rather than a new belief. Something once confusing becomes workable. A decision feels less urgent. Attention settles. These changes are easy to miss if one expects guidance to resemble instruction rather than orientation. The risk of projection is acknowledged across traditions. Humans can mistake desire, fear, or social conditioning for guidance. Discernment practices exist to counter this tendency, emphasizing humility, consultation, and self-examination. Silence helps by slowing interpretation. Without immediate answers, individuals are forced to observe their own reactions, noticing what persists and what fades. This process reduces the likelihood of confusing impulse with insight. From both psychological and spiritual perspectives, silence is not opposed to meaning. It creates space for integration. Clarity that emerges too quickly often lacks depth, while clarity that follows waiting tends to be resilient. Silence allows contradictions to surface and resolve, and it prevents the mind from locking prematurely onto explanations that feel reassuring but remain untested. In this sense, silence often precedes clarity because understanding requires conditions that noise disrupts, and what appears absent may be the very medium through which insight slowly takes shape. The idea of a hidden or private calling suggests that purpose often develops inwardly long before it takes recognizable form in the world. Rather than appearing as a clear role or public mission, it begins as a quiet orientation, an accumulation of interests, sensitivities, questions, and limits that slowly shape how a person relates to life. This internal unfolding can feel indistinct, even frustrating, because it resists immediate definition. Yet history repeatedly shows that many enduring contributions emerged from long periods of obscurity, where preparation occurred without acknowledgement or assurance. Across disciplines and eras, meaningful roles have frequently begun anonymously. Writers produced work in private for years before publication. Scientists pursued ideas that were ignored or dismissed before being understood. Social reformers often developed convictions internally long before circumstances allowed expression. In these cases, anonymity was not a flaw in the process, but a condition that allowed ideas to mature without distortion. Without the pressure of recognition, individuals were free to refine their thinking, confront weaknesses, and adapt to complexity. Psychological frameworks help explain why purpose tends to develop quietly. Identity formation is not instantaneous. It evolves through exploration, contradiction, and revision. Early in life, individuals often adopt provisional identities shaped by family, culture, or opportunity. Over time, these identities are tested against experience. A calling that emerges too early can harden into performance rather than understanding. When development is allowed to remain internal, identity can adjust gradually, integrating both capability and limitation. The concept of delayed self-concept further clarifies this process. People do not always know who they are becoming while the change is underway. Self-understanding often lags behind growth. Skills develop before confidence. Values clarify after conflict. Purpose becomes intelligible only when enough internal structure exists to recognize it. What feels like uncertainty may actually be a phase where the self has not yet caught up with its own development. Intrinsic motivation also plays a critical role. Purpose that is driven primarily by external reward or recognition tends to be fragile, dependent on validation. In contrast, motivation that grows internally through curiosity, concern, or sustained interest can persist without affirmation. Psychological research shows that intrinsically motivated individuals are more resilient and adaptable because their engagement is rooted in meaning rather than outcome. A hidden calling protects this motivation by keeping it insulated from premature evaluation. Modern comparison culture complicates this process. Constant exposure to visible achievement creates the impression that purpose must be immediately legible and publicly affirmed. Social metrics reward clarity, speed, and confidence, even when these are superficial. Under such conditions, individuals may mistake visibility for significance and prematurely commit to identities that attract approval rather than reflect authenticity. Comparison shifts attention outward, away from the slow internal work where genuine direction forms. Public validation can further distort calling by encouraging performance over alignment. When recognition becomes the measure of worth, choices are filtered through anticipated response rather than internal coherence. This dynamic can silence uncertainty, which is essential for growth. A hidden calling resists this pressure by remaining undefined long enough to develop integrity. It allows questions to remain open and skills to form without the burden of explanation. Importantly, a hidden calling is not a claim to uniqueness or superiority. It does not imply that one's purpose is more important than another's, nor that obscurity itself is virtuous. The emphasis is on timing and readiness. Some forms of responsibility require internal capacity that cannot be rushed. Visibility before readiness often leads to fragmentation, where external demands outpace internal resources. Privacy allows alignment to develop before exposure tests it. Readiness involves more than competence. It includes emotional regulation, ethical grounding, and the ability to tolerate ambiguity. These qualities are rarely visible and cannot be conferred through recognition. They are formed through reflection, restraint, and experience. A calling that emerges after this formation is more likely to be sustainable because it is supported by structure rather than impulse. The discovery of such a calling rarely feels dramatic. It often appears as a narrowing of options, a steadiness of attention, or a sense that certain commitments no longer require justification. This clarity is usually retrospective, understood only after patterns repeat and direction stabilizes. The process demands patience because it unfolds at the pace of integration, not desire. Ultimately, a hidden calling underscores the value of self-honesty and restraint. It requires resisting the urge to announce meaning before it has taken shape and tolerating periods where purpose feels undefined. Discovery, in this sense, is less about finding something new and more about allowing what is forming to become visible when the conditions are sufficient to support it. Silence is often interpreted as absence of direction, affirmation, or progress. When nothing seems to respond, it is easy to assume that effort is unnoticed or that momentum has stalled. Yet many developmental processes rely on periods of reduced stimulation, where growth occurs without visible markers. In this sense, silence can function less as neglect and more as preparation, creating conditions that shape internal stability before external demands arrive. Periods of quiet or waiting frequently train clarity by removing excess signals. When external input decreases, attention naturally turns inward. Psychological research on solitude suggests that moderate, chosen quiet supports self-regulation and reflective capacity. Without constant feedback, individuals become more aware of their own reactions, assumptions, and emotional patterns. This awareness is foundational for discernment, as it allows people to differentiate between impulse and considered response. Silence does not supply answers, but it sharpens perception. Resilience is also strengthened in these phases. When progress is not immediately rewarded, individuals are forced to rely on internal motivation rather than external reinforcement. Research on delayed gratification shows that the ability to tolerate waiting is linked to long-term adaptability and goal persistence. Learning to remain engaged without affirmation builds emotional endurance. It trains the capacity to continue acting with care and consistency, even when outcomes are uncertain or invisible. Cognitive integration plays a quieter role during these periods. The mind continues processing experience beneath conscious awareness, organizing information, resolving contradictions, and forming coherent narratives. Studies in learning and creativity demonstrate that insight often follows incubation time away from active problem solving. Silence allows this integration to occur without pressure. What feels like stagnation may actually be consolidation, where scattered impressions settle into usable understanding. Emotional regulation is another outcome of sustained quiet. In the absence of immediate reaction from others, emotional responses are less likely to escalate or be reinforced. Individuals learn to sit with discomfort, disappointment, or uncertainty without discharging it through performance or explanation. This containment builds stability. Over time, emotions become less directive and more informative, contributing to balanced judgment. Silence also reduces dependency on external validation. Constant feedback trains attention outward, making self-worth contingent on response. When visibility decreases, the individual is compelled to assess motivation more honestly. Why continue if no one is watching? This question can be uncomfortable, but it clarifies commitment. Psychological research suggests that intrinsic motivation becomes more accessible when external rewards are limited. Silence removes incentives that can distort intention, leaving behind what is genuinely sustaining. Discernment benefits from this independence. When decisions are not immediately affirmed or challenged, individuals must evaluate them against internal criteria. This process is slower but more reliable. It encourages reflection on values, consequences, and consistency over time. Silence makes it harder to outsource judgment, which strengthens the ability to choose responsibly when stakes increase. It is important not to romanticize isolation. Extended silence can be difficult and in some cases harmful, particularly when it is imposed or accompanied by social disconnection. Humans require relationship and feedback to remain grounded. The preparatory function of silence depends on balance and context. It is not withdrawal from life, but a modulation of exposure. Healthy quiet alternates with engagement, allowing integration without severing connection. Acknowledging the difficulty of these phases matters because struggle does not invalidate their function. Boredom, doubt, and restlessness often accompany reduced visibility. These experiences surface unresolved expectations and unmet needs. Rather than signaling failure, they reveal areas requiring attention. When navigated with support and perspective, they contribute to maturity rather than depletion. Silence can also recalibrate ambition. Without immediate opportunities for display, goals are evaluated for sustainability rather than impressiveness. This recalibration is essential before responsibility increases. Roles that affect others require steadiness more than urgency. Silence tests whether an individual can maintain coherence without stimulation, a prerequisite for managing complexity later. From this perspective, silence is not a pause before recognition. but a stabilizing phase before responsibility. It shapes the internal conditions necessary for meaningful engagement. When visibility eventually returns, the individual is less reactive, less dependent, and more capable of acting with proportion. What emerges from silence is not certainty, but capacity, the ability to respond rather than react, to discern rather than rush, and to carry responsibility without being consumed by it. Living responsibly with a sense of hidden guidance requires a balance between openness and restraint. When direction is felt rather than declared, the risk is not confusion but over-interpretation. Grounded practices provide stability in this space. Regular reflection allows experiences to be examined without exaggeration, helping individuals notice patterns while resisting the urge to force meaning. Ethical consistency anchors interpretation and behavior rather than feeling, ensuring that perceived guidance aligns with values that are sustainable and accountable. Humility plays a central role in this process. A sense of guidance does not exempt one from error or complexity. Mystical traditions and psychological research alike caution against mistaking intensity for truth. Humility keeps interpretation provisional, open to correction. It allows individuals to revise understanding as new information emerges. This stance reduces the likelihood of illusion by acknowledging that insight develops over time and remains incomplete. Service further grounds hidden guidance in reality. When attention turns outward toward the needs of others, interpretation becomes less self-referential. Acts of service test whether a sense of direction produces constructive outcomes or merely reinforces self-importance. Service also introduces feedback from lived consequences rather than abstract conviction. It connects inner orientation with tangible impact, which is a critical check against fantasy. Discernment matures through questioning rather than certainty. Instead of asking whether an experience is definitively meaningful, discernment asks whether it leads to greater coherence, responsibility, and care over time. This evaluative process accepts ambiguity as necessary. Psychological models of mature decision-making emphasize iterative assessment, where choices are revisited and adjusted rather than finalized prematurely. Questioning sustains flexibility, allowing guidance to refine itself through experience. Understanding silence as meaningful rather than as personal failure provides significant psychological reassurance. When periods of quiet are framed as absence, self-doubt intensifies. Individuals may interpret lack of feedback as inadequacy or neglect. Reframing silence as part of a developmental rhythm reduces this distress. It normalizes waiting and uncertainty as conditions for integration rather than indicators of deficiency. This perspective supports emotional regulation and reduces compulsive seeking for validation. Self-trust emerges gradually from this reframing. Trust does not mean assuming correctness, but believing in one's capacity to respond adaptively. When individuals learn that clarity can follow waiting, they become less reactive to uncertainty. This patience stabilizes attention and reduces anxiety-driven decisions. Psychological resilience is strengthened when uncertainty is tolerated without collapse. Openness to change is equally important. Hidden guidance is often misused when it becomes a fixed narrative about identity or destiny. Clinging to predetermined interpretations restricts growth. Developmental psychology highlights the importance of revisable self-concepts, where identity remains responsive to experience. Allowing guidance to evolve prevents rigidity and protects against disappointment when reality diverges from expectation. This openness requires releasing the need for explanation. Not every experience must be categorized or justified. Some insights only make sense after they have shaped behavior. By allowing meaning to remain implicit, individuals avoid imposing coherence prematurely. This restraint preserves curiosity and adaptability, qualities essential for responsible action. Ethical consistency remains the most reliable measure of alignment. When choices consistently support integrity, fairness, and care, they provide a stable framework for interpretation. Feelings fluctuate, but ethical orientation offers continuity. Over time, This consistency builds confidence that one's direction, however undefined, is not arbitrary. Living with hidden guidance therefore becomes less about decoding messages and more about cultivating character. It shifts focus from outcome to process, from identity to practice. The emphasis is on becoming rather than arriving. Each phase contributes to capacity, even when its purpose is not immediately apparent. In this way, a hidden calling is not something to claim, but something that forms through participation in life. It unfolds through reflection, service, patience, and revision. The absence of certainty does not weaken this process. It strengthens it by keeping the individual responsive and grounded. What emerges is not a fixed role, but a way of engaging with the world that remains attentive, responsible, and open to what continues to take shape.